Karoline Leavitt gives up first-class seat for a veteran. Then the unbelievable happens. The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the plane, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. It had been a long day, briefings, press calls, and the relentless whirlwind of Washington, D.C. politics. As the youngest White House press secretary, she wasn't just making statements. She was in the trenches, battling the media every day. But today, she was heading home. A short flight to Manchester, New Hampshire, where for a few days, she could simply be Karoline, the small-town girl who once scooped ice cream at her family's shop. She adjusted her carry-on bag and moved through the aisle. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the distinct, sterile tang of airplane upholstery. Every row was packed, passengers shifting in their seats, adjusting armrests, flipping through in-flight magazines. First class wasn't a luxury for her, it was a necessity. With constant travel as part of the White House team, a little extra space and quiet made a difference. She reached her seat, settled in, and exhaled. Then, she saw him. An elderly man, maybe in his late 80s, moving carefully down the aisle. His frail frame was wrapped in a well-worn jacket, and on his head sat a cap embroidered with two simple but powerful words: World War II veteran. It wasn't just a hat, it was a symbol, a quiet testament to sacrifice. Karoline watched as he made his way down the narrow aisle, gripping each seat for support. Around him, most passengers barely noticed, too engrossed in their phones, their books, their own exhaustion. But Karoline saw something else. Not just physical weariness, but a deep, heavy kind of exhaustion. The kind carried by a man who had borne more than his fair share of burdens in life. The flight attendant directed him toward seat 26B, far back, in economy, squeezed between two other passengers. Karoline looked at the cramped row. The lack of legroom, the long journey ahead, something about it didn't sit right. She stood. "Sir," she said, stepping into the aisle. The veteran looked up, slightly startled. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with wisdom, met hers. "Yes?" She hesitated for only a moment, then gestured toward her seat. "I'd be honored if you took my spot up here." A beat of silence stretched between them. The veteran blinked, surprised. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "Please," she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "You've already done so much for this country. Let me do this for you." The flight attendant overheard the exchange and stepped forward. "That's very kind of you, Miss Leavitt." Passengers began to take notice. A businessman 2 rows back paused from checking his emails. A young woman with headphones pulled them down. A middle-aged couple exchanged knowing glances. The veteran let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, if you insist. But only if you let me buy you a coffee when we land." Karoline smiled. "Deal." The flight attendant helped him into the first-class seat while Karoline grabbed her bag and made her way to the back. She didn't do it for attention. She didn't do it for recognition. It just felt right. But as she slipped into 26B, sandwiched between 2 passengers, she had no idea that this small act of kindness had just set something much bigger into motion. Before the plane even landed, something unbelievable was about to happen. A chilling revelation. Just as Karoline was settling into her new seat, the man next to her, a middle-aged passenger in a wrinkled button-down, leaned in slightly. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You know who that is, right?" She turned to him, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" He nodded toward first class, where the veteran was now adjusting the recline of his seat, his aged hands gripping the armrest, as if they carried more than just the weight of his body. "That guy," the man muttered. "That's not just any veteran, that's Joseph Monroe." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it made her stomach tighten. "I don't—" "Who is he?" she asked. The man huffed a quiet laugh. "Of course you wouldn't know. They don't talk about guys like him much anymore." Karoline's brow furrowed. Something about the way he said guys like him felt loaded, not in a malicious way, but as if he knew something she didn't. He lowered his voice. "Monroe was in the 82nd Airborne during World War II. Paratrooper. But after the war—" He trailed off, his expression unreadable. Let's just say he got caught up in things. A prickle of unease ran down Karoline's spine. Something told her this flight was about to become unforgettable. An uneasy feeling? A chill crept along the back of Karoline's neck. What kind of things? She asked. The man beside her darted his eyes around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then, in a hushed tone, he said, CIA Black Ops. The kind of missions that don't officially exist. Karoline felt her pulse quicken. Then, in the 70s, he disappeared, just vanished. The man shook his head. Some people think he was involved in something big, something the government wanted, buried. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as another conspiracy theory. She had spent enough time in Washington to know how quickly half-truths could be twisted into dramatic stories. But there was something about this man's tone. The certainty in his voice gave her pause. And then, right on cue, Joseph Monroe turned his head. Their eyes met. She felt it before she saw it. That subtle, heavy awareness of being watched. His gaze wasn't unkind, but it was piercing, studying her, as if he knew exactly what she was hearing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded. Not a nod of gratitude. Not just acknowledgement. Something else, Karoline swallowed. Something had shifted in the cabin. It was subtle at first. A few whispered conversations, quick glances in her direction. Then she noticed the flight attendant. She approached Monroe with a warm smile, handing him a drink. But her eyes flicked toward Karoline, for just a second too long, and then there was the man in 24A. 2 rows ahead, he twisted slightly in his seat, just enough to glance back toward first class, just enough to look at Monroe. Unlike the others, he wasn't whispering to a seatmate. He wasn't typing on his phone. He was watching, focused, too focused. A quiet unease settled in Karoline's stomach. Was this paranoia? Was she reading too much into a harmless situation? The overhead speakers crackled. Then the captain's voice came through. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing an unexpected systems check from air traffic control. Nothing to be concerned about, but we'll be in a holding pattern for the next 20 minutes. Flight attendants, please remain in position. Karoline sat up straighter. She had taken enough flights to know that holding patterns weren't unusual, but something about the way the announcement was phrased, it felt off. Beside her, the man let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah. That's not normal. She turned to him. What do you mean? He nodded toward the window. We're mid-flight. No turbulence, no airspace congestion. A systems check from air traffic control at this altitude? That's just vague enough to mean nothing and everything. Karoline clenched her jaw. Maybe she was overthinking things. Maybe this was just a weird coincidence. But her gut was telling her otherwise. And then, from first class, Joseph Monroe turned again. This time, he locked eyes with her, intentionally. Karoline unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The man next to her glanced up, surprised. Where are you going? She didn't hesitate. To get some answers. She walked carefully up the aisle, ignoring the glances from other passengers. Her heartbeat picked up as she reached Monroe's row. He saw her coming. Without hesitation, he gestured for her to take the empty seat beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Monroe let out a slow breath and said, You didn't have to give up your seat for me. Karoline shook her head. It was the right thing to do. Monroe studied her. Up close, she could see the deep lines in his face. Not just the kind that came with age, but the kind that came from carrying too many burdens for too many years. Then, in a low voice, he said, You have no idea what you just walked into, do you? Her throat tightened. What does that mean? Monroe glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. Then, in a voice so low she had to lean in to hear, he murmured, They're watching me. Karoline's pulse jumped. Who? Monroe exhaled through his nose. People who don't, like old secrets resurfacing. She swallowed hard. And you think this flight delay has something to do with you? Monroe gave a slow, measured nod. I know it does. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "I don't get it," she admitted. "You're a veteran, a war hero. Why would anyone be watching you now?" Monroe leaned back in his seat. And then, with the quiet certainty of a man who had seen too much, he said, "Because some wars don't end when the fighting stops." Buried secrets. Monroe's jaw tightened. "Because I didn't just fight in the war," he said, voice low. "I fought after it. And the things I did, the things I know, some people would rather stay buried." A prickle of unease slid down Karoline's spine. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the conversation. "Miss Leavitt." She turned. It was him. The man from 24A. He stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "I need you to come with me." Before she could process what was happening, Monroe's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His fingers, stronger than they should have been for a man his age, wrapped around her like iron. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto hers. "Don't go with him," he muttered under his breath. Karoline's stomach twisted. The man from 24A waited, unreadable. He wasn't a flight attendant. He wasn't wearing an airline badge. He looked official, but official in a way she couldn't quite place. "Miss Leavitt," he repeated, his voice calm, insistent. "I need you to come with me." The entire first-class cabin was watching now. A flight attendant, hesitant, stepped forward. "Sir, I need to ask why you're—" The man didn't even look at her. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket. A badge. Not TSA, not airport security, Federal Aviation Administration. "This is a matter of security." His eyes flicked to Monroe for the briefest second before returning to Karoline. "Come with me, please." Her breath caught. The FAA? What the hell did the FAA want with her? She glanced down at Monroe. His grip hadn't loosened. His expression darkened. "They're not FAA," he whispered. "I've seen this before. They want something." Karoline didn't know what to believe, but something about this felt wrong. Her instincts told her to play along, at least until she understood what was happening. Slowly, she pried Monroe's fingers from her wrist and stood. The flight attendant still looked uneasy, but she stepped back as Karoline followed the man toward the front of the plane. Passengers stared. Some whispered. Others simply watched, wide-eyed. Beyond, the curtain separating first class from the cockpit area, another man was waiting. A second official-looking figure. Karoline Leavitt. The second man studied her face. "Do you have any knowledge of an individual on this flight named Joseph Monroe?" Her pulse pounded. The first man cut in. "We believe he's in possession of classified material. Something that," he hesitated, chose his words carefully. "Something that could compromise national security." Karoline's skin went cold. "What?" she breathed. The second man lowered his voice. "Miss Leavitt, we need you to remain calm. We believe he boarded this flight with documents that were never meant to see the light of day." She could barely process what they were saying. "So why are you talking to me?" The first man gave her a long look. "Because he trusts you." Her stomach clenched. They weren't wrong. Monroe had barely spoken to anyone else. He had locked eyes with her, pulled her into his confidence. He had chosen her, and now these men, whoever they really were, wanted her to help them. "I don't know anything," she said carefully. "I gave him my seat, that's it." The second man studied her, eyes sharp as if weighing whether she was telling the truth. Then, the plane jolted. Not a soft tremor, a sudden, sharp drop. All three of them swayed. The first man's radio crackled. A voice, urgent, muffled. His posture changed instantly. His expression stiffened. He pressed a hand to his earpiece. The second man did the same. A beat. Then, without another word, they both turned, abruptly, and hurried toward the cockpit. Karoline stood there, heart hammering. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. This flight was no longer just a routine trip home. And then, the entire plane lurched. Hard. Passengers screamed. The plane dropped. Not turbulence, not a subtle shift, a gut-wrenching, Stomach-lifting plunge that sent drinks flying, passengers gasping. Overhead bins rattled. A chorus of panicked cries filled the cabin. Karoline grabbed the nearest seat, knuckles white, bracing herself as her heart slammed against her ribs. Flight. Attendants scrambled for their jump seats, strapping in. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, strained but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence." But Karoline knew. This wasn't turbulence, this was something else, something far worse. She knocked on the cockpit door. "Captain?" No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. "What's going on?" Silence. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. Then, another jolt. Not turbulence, not weather. Something was wrong with the plane. Across the aisle, a man gripped his armrest, knuckles white. "Are we going down?" he muttered, voice shaky. Karoline refused to believe that. She turned to the flight attendant. "Do you have communication with the cockpit?" The woman shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not responding." Karoline's stomach twisted. This wasn't a malfunction, this was a hijacking. Her first instinct was to stand up, demand answers, push through the panic. But then she remembered Monroe's last words. Don't trust them. Not just the agents. Anyone. Her eyes flicked to the bag. If Monroe had risked everything to get it to her, if the agents had taken him without checking what he was carrying, that meant whatever was inside this bag was the most important thing on this plane. And if they realized she had it, she was next. Her pulse pounded. Around her, passengers were panicking, fumbling with oxygen masks, voices rising in fear. She needed time. She needed a plan. Carefully, quietly, she reached down and pulled Monroe's bag onto her lap. The zipper was stiff. The fabric worn. Her fingers brushed against the sealed envelope, the one with the government insignia. She hesitated. Opening something like this was beyond dangerous. If she got caught with classified documents, it wouldn't just be the agents after her. It would be the government itself. But then she felt it. Something else. Small. Metal. A flash drive. Her breath hitched. The envelope contained secrets on paper. But the drive. The drive was something else entirely. Before she could process it, the cockpit door unlocked. She shoved the bag back under her seat, just as the first agent stepped out, alone. Monroe was gone, and the agent, normally composed, was pale. His eyes landed on Karoline. He started toward her. She had seconds to decide what to do. But before he reached her, the intercom crackled. The captain's voice returned. Only this time, something was wrong. The words were too slow, too measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." A pause. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an unscheduled landing." Another pause. "Remain calm. Further instructions will be provided shortly." A chill ran down Karoline's spine. The agent was still walking toward her. His steps were deliberate. His expression, unreadable. Her mind raced. The cockpit had been locked. The pilots hadn't responded. And now, suddenly, the captain was back on the intercom, sounding like he was being forced to speak. The pieces snapped together. He wasn't speaking freely. Someone was controlling him. And Monroe? He was gone. Karoline swallowed hard, keeping her face neutral as the agent reached her row. He crouched slightly, voice low beneath the hum of murmurs and panic. "I need you to come with me." She shook her head. "I don't think so." His jaw tightened, but he didn't grab her. Instead, he leaned in further. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Her pulse pounded. He knew. Monroe had warned her. Don't trust them. That meant she had one option left. She met the agent's gaze and lowered her voice. "If I go with you, the whole plane will know something's wrong." The agent didn't move. She pressed on. "You don't want that. You want control. You want quiet." Her voice dropped even lower. But if you drag me out of this seat, you won't have that anymore. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. He straightened, glancing around. Passengers were already watching. Flight attendants were whispering to each other, uncertain but ready to step in, and Karoline saw it. He wasn't in charge. Not really. Whoever had taken Monroe, whoever had forced the captain's message, this agent was just a pawn. So she did something that went against every instinct. She relaxed, or at least she pretended to. She exhaled, nodding slightly. "I don't want trouble," she murmured. "I just want to land safely." It was a gamble, a big one, because if she could make him think she wasn't a threat, he might back off. The agent studied her for a long moment. Then, to her shock, he gave the smallest nod and walked away. Karoline barely had time to process what had just happened before. The intercom crackled again, but this time the voice that came through was different, raw, strained, terrified. "This is your captain." Heavy pause, then through gritted teeth. "Do not land this plane." The intercom cut out. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Karoline's blood ran cold. The real captain had just spoken, and whoever had controlled the last announcement. They weren't in charge anymore. The plane jolted, as if fighting, against an unseen force, against whatever had been planned. And that's when Karoline knew. Monroe had been right. Someone had wanted him gone. Someone had wanted this plane redirected, and she was sitting on the only proof left. Her fingers curled around Monroe's bag. She didn't know who to trust. She didn't know where this plane was about to land. But she knew one thing. Whatever was on that flash drive, it was worth killing for. And that meant it was worth fighting for.